Today we're going to take a slightly more serious tone and talk about why Bitcoin continues to rise. And obviously I don't know when you're going to watch this video. I don't know what the shelf life of this video is going to be like. So if you watch this video a year from now, 2 years from now, whatever, then obviously be conscious of the fact that this was done in November of 2017. Now with that in mind, we have seen very parabolic growth in Bitcoin over the past year. If we look at this chart here, I mean, you can see that back at this time last year, it was trading at roughly $750, and we're all the way up at $6,500 now. It's almost gone up 10 times in the past year, or 1,000% return. Now, for perspective here, the stock market in the same period of time has returned roughly, I believe, 25% year over year in the S&P 500. And if you look at a number of tech companies, you're talking somewhere between 50 to 100%. So of course the increase in the value of Bitcoin is certainly unique in the sense of scale, how much it's gone up. And a lot of people are asking the question, why does it continue to go up? Because if we think about the fundamentals of Bitcoin, I know a lot of people are going to hate me saying this, but they haven't changed all that much in the past year. You know, we have implemented a scaling solution in SegWit. We are starting to think about other scaling solutions, of course, which I believe will likely fail, but we don't really know. Of course, I'm talking about the 2x hard fork, where they double the size of the blocks. We don't really know what's going to happen with that, but we do know that there is a major difference in the sense that we have finally settled the scaling debate, at least to some extent, right? We have SegWit, and the question is going to be moving forward, are we going to change the block size? Now, what's interesting about this to me is that one of the most fundamental metrics by which we value Bitcoin, by which we determine the adoption of Bitcoin, is the number of daily transactions, or the volume of daily transactions. And if we look at those, you'll see that the transaction volume really hasn't increased all that much over the period of a year. Right, we sort of have this trend line in the middle here at roughly 250,000 transactions a day. But does this look like a clear uptrend in the number of daily transactions? No, it doesn't, right? If we move it to 2 years, it's a little nicer looking. And that means that from 2015 to 2016, and even the early parts of 2017, we saw a nice little uptrend here. But over the past year or so, it's really, the number of daily transactions hasn't really increased that much. If you go on a 30-day rolling basis, it's still really not that impressive. And so I can even show on this particular chart the 7-day moving average, right? And then if we move to 1 year here, you can see that it's relatively flat, right? We're sort of consolidating in the number of daily transactions average per week, right? And so even with the rolling averages, we don't see a clear uptrend. And what that suggests to me is that we really aren't seeing a massive increase in adoption. Now, what a lot of people like to point out is the increase in the US dollar value of those transactions, right? Because if you look at this over the course of a year, you will see an obvious uptrend here. But let me tell you that the reason why the US dollar transaction value is increasing is just because the value of Bitcoin is increasing. And you might be saying, well, doesn't that just mean that more goods and services are being purchased with Bitcoin? So we don't care about the quantity or volume of transactions. All we care about is the value of said transactions. And while I would initially agree with you, the unfortunate reality here is that the transactions between exchanges are included here. In other words, for example, let's say you buy Bitcoin on GDAX. And in order to buy, let's say, ARK, if you wanted to buy ARK, you would have to transfer that Bitcoin over to Bittrex, and then you would have to buy ARK with the Bitcoin that you transferred over. That transaction, where you send Bitcoin from GDAX over to Bittrex, is actually a transaction that gets recorded on the blockchain. Now, all of these transactions that happen within GDAX, that happen within Bittrex, of course, those don't show on the blockchain. Those are all settled internally within the exchange's system. However, the transactions between exchanges actually do get recorded onto the blockchain, and I suspect that is the reason why we are seeing such substantial transaction volume. Now, don't get me wrong, more people are using Bitcoin now than ever, but not enough more that we should see a 10 times increase in the value of Bitcoin over a year, right? So when I think about the value of Bitcoin and how much it's increased, or excuse me, the price is what I should say. When I think about how much the price of Bitcoin has increased, it's really all been on a technical and sentiment-driven basis. So the question is, for those of us looking from the investing perspective in the long term, can Bitcoin continue to produce such increases in price despite the fact that the actual adoption of Bitcoin really hasn't done anything over the past year? And the answer is likely yes, although it's not for the reasons you would suspect. So if we think about Chris Burninsky and the way that he says that we should value cryptocurrencies, he suggests that we do it through valuing the utility value of the network. In other words, trying to determine how large does the market cap of Bitcoin have to be in order to support the transactions that take place on the network. And he goes through a bunch of metrics by which you can determine that, and the increase in adoption over time and the velocity of Bitcoin, that is, the amount of times that a single Bitcoin gets used over a certain period of time, right? Because obviously the same Bitcoin can be used for multiple transactions, right? So what I want to emphasize about all of this is that when we think about the valuation of Bitcoin, it's mostly through trying to value the utility network. And I guarantee you that the utility value of the network has not increased tenfold over the period of the past year or so. And so you're asking the question, how can Bitcoin continue to go up? And the answer is that there's two main ways by which any particular asset can be priced. The first way is through a fair valuation that's determined over time. So when we think about stocks, for example, stocks are valued through discounted cash flow analysis. They are valued through multiple analysis, ratio analysis, relative valuation, so on and so forth. Over the long term, while news can have an impact and will have an impact on stocks, they will ultimately revert to their fair value. So if there's a news event or a big headline that crashes the value of the stock, it will ultimately correct back towards a more fair value, right? If we think about Equifax recently, that is a perfect example of that. So what I want to say here is that Bitcoin is not that. Bitcoin is an incremental pricing mechanism. In other words, there is price memory. With stocks, there's no price memory. The previous price has no influence on the future price. But with Bitcoin, I am certain that that is not true. I'm certain it's not true. In other words, now that we are at $6,600, $5,000 now seems cheap. Hell, even $6,000 can seem cheap, right? Anytime that we passed another $1,000 milestone, the previous $1,000 seems cheap. If we think about $4,000, which we spent a while sort of trading in that range, now $4,000 sounds cheap, right? And if you think back to when Bitcoin was worth around $1,000 just earlier this year, that sounds absurd now. If Bitcoin went down to $1,000, to everybody that would be like the end of the world. That would be like the apocalypse. So there is price memory with Bitcoin, and the way Bitcoin is influenced is by incremental news events. So for example, recently here with Bitcoin, we saw futures are going to launch this year on CME. So the idea that CME Group is actually going to launch these derivatives based off of Bitcoin, it's supporting the market a little bit, and it's another reason why Bitcoin is heading a little bit higher, right? Anytime a news event happens, even if it shouldn't affect the fair value of Bitcoin, it still does. And this does affect the fair value, but there have been events that have happened where Bitcoin really shouldn't be influenced, but it keeps going up, right? And so what we see with Bitcoin in particular here is that news events don't have long-lasting impacts, but they do affect Bitcoin, and then there's sort of a price memory factor, right? When we think about what happened with China, we've completely forgotten about China because the most recent news always has the highest impact on Bitcoin's value. It's all based off of incrementals. And that's why Bitcoin's price just keeps going up. A lot of people are wondering, the transaction volume's not really increasing all that much. We still have the problems of high transaction fees. When we look at market cap to transaction volume ratio, we are at historic highs. And when we've been at these historic highs, it's corrected quite violently, right? So the question is, why does Bitcoin continue to go up? And the answer is simple. We keep seeing incremental news events that are positive, that we are completely ignoring any of the negative news events. For example, China getting out of the market. But if China suddenly decided that they wanted to get back into the market, right, then Bitcoin would skyrocket. It's as if we have completely priced out the fact that Bitcoin lost 15% of the trading volume, and now we're just moving on to new heights as we move into the Bitcoin 2x hard fork, which is anticipated to happen on November 16th, 2017. And so the answer to all of your questions really in the end here is Bitcoin continues to go up. We just broke through 6,600. The reason it keeps going up is because people are not looking at the fundamentals of Bitcoin. They're not looking at the past news events and what their long-term impact is. That's a perfect example again with China, where we lost 15% of the trading volume for Bitcoin, and it continues to go up. In addition, I also think there are people manipulating the price of Bitcoin. It's not difficult to do so because these exchanges are very loosely regulated, and I've mentioned this in previous videos where I've seen evidence of spoofing. I have seen evidence of people that are sort of cooking this order book so that anytime it seems thin on one particular side, they bid up the prices very far, right? So for example, you have this huge sell wall that we have here, but I guarantee you a majority of that sell wall is not legitimate. In other words, I don't think they actually want to sell 57, now 62 Bitcoin. I think they only want to sell, actually I don't even know if they want to sell any Bitcoin at all. I think they just want to reduce the price a little bit so that they can get in a little bit cheaper. And if they see that this buy wall, which is genuine, right? This is a legitimate 3 Bitcoin that people want to buy. If they see this wall get bigger and bigger, then they'll move up their wall. And I've seen plenty of evidence of this over time, and it's kind of concerning to me. You see how fast that actually changed there, because it's completely done by algorithms and trading bots, right? So when we think about Bitcoin, it is being manipulated by whales. It's based off of incremental price increases as a result of news events. And in the long term here, yes, Bitcoin will be valued based off of fundamentals. But at what point that's going to happen, I don't know. But this is why people call Bitcoin a bubble. It's charts like this one, where you say the adoption of Bitcoin's increasing. Yeah, more businesses are accepting Bitcoin now than ever. But when we look at transaction volume over the past year or so, not much has actually happened with it. So, you know, it's tough to say. It is. It's actually very tough to say what exactly we should think about here in terms of, you know, was Bitcoin just really undervalued? I mean, that's the other argument here that you can make is, you know what, even though the transaction volume on a rolling basis is similar, when we think about transaction volume relative to the market cap ratio, it was being undervalued. It was not being assigned a fair multiple. In stocks, we talk about a fair multiple for stocks, or basically the fair price that you should pay per dollar of earnings. Well, maybe we weren't paying a fair multiple for this transaction volume, and we should be paying more because more growth potential is possible with Bitcoin. However, the multiple was already fairly high. So again, when we think about the fundamentals of Bitcoin, I want you to keep this information in mind, that when it comes to transaction volume, which I believe to be the most fundamental indicator or the best way to value or measure Bitcoin's adoption, it's pathetic in the sense that there's no real growth in transaction volume on a daily basis. Not even if you do it over a 7-day rolling period or a 30-day rolling period. Anyway, let me know your thoughts about why Bitcoin continues to go up in price. Again, I have a feeling that a lot of it has to do with FOMO. I have a feeling that it has a lot to do with incremental news. And I have a feeling that it has a lot to do with price memory, right? When we see $6,600, $6,000 seems cheap. So when it goes down like this, people panic buy the dip because we're in a bull market right now. Why wouldn't you buy the dip, right? That's the argument, at least. Because as long as we continue to be in a bull trend, buying the dip will always be the correct strategy. And then the big question is going to be, if this is overvalued, if Bitcoin has overextended, at what point is it going to correct? Because if we think back to the dot-com bubble, it took multiple years for that to correct. So I'm not saying that Bitcoin is a bubble, but it definitely has characteristics of one, given that the fundamentals have not improved that much, and the transaction volume that we are seeing is likely the result of transactions between exchanges that really aren't true adoption. They're just people trying to speculate on altcoins rather than Bitcoin, right? So in the end here, I would love to hear your thoughts. It's obviously a fairly deep topic. Obviously, I think Bitcoin is going to be very important for the future, but I do think it's possible that it's rose a little bit too quick, too fast. Something to think about. Relative to other asset classes, you know I've talked about this in my previous video where I said if Bitcoin is a bubble, so is everything else. I think that every asset class has appreciated a little bit faster than it should. So, again, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. I know that this video was a little bit of rambling here, but I just wanted to get this off of my chest and sort of talk about it a little bit because, you know, there's plenty of money to be made here through trading, but I hope everybody that's investing in Bitcoin is aware of the fact when you invest, you should be investing based off of the fundamentals. And this chart here, if we were thinking of this chart as the fundamentals over the past year, really doesn't encourage me all that much that Bitcoin should be trading at a massive premium. Now, we do know that we have the derivatives markets that are getting established throughout 2018. We know that there's the chance of the ETF approval. We know that hard forks create additional cryptocurrencies and people like their free money. So yes, there's plenty of reasons for Bitcoin to continue to go up. I'm not saying it's going to go down anytime soon. I'm not even saying that it's overvalued, but there is evidence to suggest that it is, and I would love for all of you to think about that and give me your thoughts in the comments. And give me real thoughts. Don't just tell me that Bitcoin's going to be the future and revolutionize the world and take over this and take over that, because I want real arguments. Probably the best argument that can be made here is that Bitcoin is turning into a store of value, which means that it's taking over gold's market share, which means that we have that $7 to $8 trillion market that Bitcoin can tap into. And that's where the value is coming from. Not from the use as a payment network, but rather as a use as a store of value. And that's probably the best argument you can make, but I don't think that that's the future of Bitcoin. I think it's a part of the future for Bitcoin, but I think that this transaction volume really has to go up a lot before the value of Bitcoin can skyrocket as well. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video. As usual, leave a like, comment, and subscription, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you for watching.